The first time I heard someone say it out loud, I was standing behind the feed store in Gretna with a sack of grain over one shoulder and nowhere particular to be for the next 10 minutes. Two men I recognized by face but not by character were leaning against the south wall, talking in the easy way men talk when they believe nobody worth worrying about is close enough to hear. One of them said it plain, the way you'd state a fact about the weather, that no man with sense was going to take on Agnes Farrow's situation. Not with what she owed, not with 2 daughters and a farm that was more grief than ground by that point. The other one agreed. I stood there with the grain on my shoulder and listened to them finish their conversation, and then I walked around the corner and loaded my wagon without saying anything to either of them, because what I had to say wasn't for those men. It was for a decision I'd been turning over in my mind for 6 weeks, and that, as of that afternoon, I had finished turning. Let me tell you about Agnes first, because she deserves a proper introduction, and because the men behind the feed store had her wrong in every direction that matters. I had known Agnes Farrow for 4 years, since before her husband Conrad had gotten sick. Conrad and I had run adjacent grazing rights along the creek bottom west of Gretna, Nebraska, and we'd been the kind of neighbors that the distance of the plains produces, not close in the way of people who see each other daily, but steady. The kind of closeness built from showing up reliably at the moments that count. When Conrad's cattle got into my north pasture 3 summers running, we fixed the fence together every time without keeping score. When my well went bad in August 2 years ago, Conrad lent me his water rights for 6 weeks and never mentioned repayment. Conrad died in the winter of 1881 of a lung illness that took 11 months to finish what it started, which is the worst kind, because it gives you long enough to understand exactly what you're losing, and not quite long enough to make peace with it. Agnes nursed him through all of it while running the farm and raising their girls, Eleanor, who was 14 that winter, and Grace, who was 9, and had her father's particular way of looking at a problem sideways before she looked at it directly, which was already a quality you could see in her and which I suspected would serve her well for the rest of her life. After Conrad died, Agnes inherited what Conrad had built, which was 110 acres of genuinely good Nebraska land, a sound house, 2 horses, 30 head of cattle, and a debt of $640 against the east parcel. A note Conrad had taken out 2 springs prior to expand the herd before the illness came, and the expansion never materialized the way he'd planned. $640 was not by itself an unsurvivable sum. The problem was that it came due in full the following October, and cattle prices that year were what they were, and the bank in Gretna, specifically a man named Croft, who had managed that branch for 11 years, and whose sympathy ran to the edge of his professional obligations, and no further, was not in a position to extend new terms to a woman without a husband's signature on the refinancing. That was the shape of it. That was the arithmetic the men behind the feed store were doing when they concluded that Agnes Farrow was a situation no sensible man would want to inherit. They were doing the arithmetic wrong. What they weren't counting, because they didn't know to count it, was a piece of business I had conducted in the town of Kearney 8 weeks prior. I had ridden there on a Tuesday in late August, not for any reason that would have been obvious to anyone watching me go. And I had visited the law office of a man named Hadley, who handled land transactions across 4 counties, and I had laid out a straightforward proposition. I wanted to purchase the note on the east parcel of the Farrow property, not the land itself, not a claim against Agnes, but the debt, the right to hold it, which, under the terms Conrad had signed, was transferable with the bank's agreement, and which the bank agreed to readily enough, because banks generally prefer certainty over the possibility of a complicated collection from a widow they'd have to take to court. I paid $640 for a piece of paper. It took most of what I had in reserve and required me to sell a portion of my own herd at a time when I'd rather have kept them. I didn't tell anyone I'd done it. Not my hands, not my sister in Omaha, not the men behind the feed store. I put the paper in the lockbox under my bed and continued on with the fall work, waiting for the right time. I want to say something here plainly before the story gets to the part where it might seem like I did something clever, because clever isn't what I was going for, and it isn't what I want you to take from this. I'd been watching Agnes Farrow manage an impossible situation with a particular kind of dignity that a person either has or doesn't, and it cannot be manufactured or borrowed, and which she had in full. I had watched her fix things that Conrad would have asked me to help with. I had watched her negotiate her own cattle prices at the fall market in a year, when every buyer in the county knew she needed to sell, and tried to use that knowledge accordingly. And I had watched her refuse 2 offers that weren't fair, and wait out a 3rd buyer until he came up to a price she could respect. I had watched Eleanor step into the role of a much older daughter without being asked to, and Grace follow her sister's lead with the seriousness of someone who understood that the family needed everyone doing their part. I had watched all of that and made up my mind about it long before August, and the question I was living with wasn't whether I wanted to do something about it. The question was whether doing something about it was mine to do. That is a different question than it sounds. There is a version of what I did that could be made to look like a man taking advantage of a difficult situation to press his own interest. I knew that, and I thought about it a great deal. A woman in debt is a woman with fewer options, and a man who removes that debt before making his intentions known could be accused of manufacturing a position of obligation. I did not want Agnes to feel obligated. I did not want her to say yes to anything, because it was the least bad option available to her. I wanted, if she said yes to anything, for it to be because she chose it on its own terms, which is why I waited. I did not go to Agnes's farm with the note in September, when she was working hardest and had least time to think. I did not go in October, when the debt was due and the pressure was highest, and a woman exhausted by harvest and fear of what came next would not have been in any condition to make a decision about anything except survival. I waited until the note came due, until Croft at the bank had been to the farm and had his conversation with Agnes about the extension she couldn't get, until she had spent a week living with the knowledge that the east parcel might have to go and the herd would have to be cut, and the whole careful structure Conrad had built would begin to come apart. I waited until the 2nd Tuesday of November, when the worst of the knowing had had time to settle into something she could stand on. I rode to her farm in the morning, which was cold and clear the way Nebraska mornings are in November, with the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens after the first real frost has cleaned the air of everything that doesn't belong. Agnes was in the yard when I arrived, splitting wood, which she had been doing herself since September, because the hand Conrad had employed had left for Kansas in October, and she hadn't yet replaced him. She stopped when she saw me coming up the road, which was not unusual. She always stopped what she was doing when someone came, the same way a person in charge of something important pays attention to anything that changes in their field of view. I got down from my horse. I took off my hat. I had practiced what I intended to say during the ride over. In the methodical way I prepare for conversations that matter, and I had come to the conclusion that the only version of this that was worth saying was the plain one. "I have something I need to show you," I said, "and something I need to ask you." in that order. The second thing doesn't depend on the first. I want you to know that before I show you anything." She looked at me with the directness she had. A person who's been managing hard things alone for long enough develops a particular relationship with other people's stated intentions. They listen for what's underneath, rather than what's on top. "All right," she said. I reached into my coat and took out the paper. She read it twice. I watched her face go through something that took a full minute and that I did not try to name while it was happening. She read the amount. She read Conrad's original signature still on the document. She looked up at me. "You bought it," she said. "In August," I said. "From the bank, through a lawyer in Kearney. The note is paid in full as of this morning. I filed the satisfaction of debt with the county recorder before I came here. The east parcel is clear. Hadley will send you the documentation by end of week." She looked at the paper again. Her hands were steady, which I noted because a person's hands tell you things their face has learned to hide. "Why?" she said. It was not an accusation, and it was not a question exactly. It was the word a person uses when they are trying to locate the honest center of something. "Because Conrad was a good man, and he built something worth keeping," I said. "Because your daughters are going to need this land in 10 years. Because you managed this year in a way I watched and could not find fault with. And because a bank's terms and a piece of paper shouldn't be the thing that decides what happens to a family that has done nothing wrong." I held her gaze. "And because I wanted to. I want to be honest about that part too, because leaving it out would make the rest of it a performance." She was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved between us. "You said you had something to ask," she said. "I do," I said. "But the asking has nothing to do with the note, and if your answer is no, the note stays paid regardless. I want you to understand that as an absolute truth before I ask." She nodded once, which told me she did. "I would like to court you," I said as plainly as I knew how to say it. "Properly. At whatever pace makes sense to you, with the full understanding that there is no obligation attached to this morning's business, and that if at any point you would rather I not come around, I will respect that without making it difficult." The yard was quiet. Somewhere across the pasture, one of her horses moved in the far shelter, and the sound carried in the still air. Grace appeared in the kitchen window and looked out at us for a moment with the particular attention of a 9-year-old who understands that something significant is happening, even without knowing the specifics, and then withdrew. Agnes looked at the paper in her hands one more time. Then she looked at me. "You rode to Kearney in August," she said. "I did. Before any of this came to a head. Before the bank's conversation. Before October." "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "No," I said. "Because in August you had enough to carry. And because I didn't want the note to be the reason for anything." She was quiet again. But it was a different quality of quiet than before. Not the quiet of someone deciding, but the quiet of someone who has already decided and is simply making sure the ground is solid before she steps onto it. "I'll make coffee," she said. "Come inside." I came inside. Eleanor was at the table with schoolwork she was doing herself, which was the situation on the Farrow farm. Agnes had continued her daughter's education in the kitchen because the schoolhouse was 4 miles and a hard winter road away, and she was not a woman who let geography make decisions for her children. Eleanor looked up at me with the evaluating look of a 14-year-old who is paying close attention to what happens to her family and has opinions about it. "Mr. Garrett," she said. "Eleanor," I said, and sat where Agnes indicated. We drank coffee and talked for 2 hours, which I will not describe in full because much of it was private, in the way that early honest conversations are private. Not secret, but not meant for anyone outside of the room. What I will tell you is that Agnes asked me hard questions, and I answered them without trying to make the answers prettier than they were. And that at the end of it, we had an understanding that was not a promise, but was more than an intention. I came back on the following Sunday for supper. I came back the Sunday after that. By December, I was coming twice a week, once to help with whatever the farm required, and once in the evening to sit with the family, which Grace had decided by the third visit was entirely normal, and which Eleanor required somewhat longer to reach the same conclusion about, which was right and proper for a girl of her age and position, and which I respected without trying to hurry it. In January, on a particularly cold afternoon when we were mending harness leather in the barn while Eleanor and Grace did their lessons inside, Agnes said, without looking up from her work, "The men in town had opinions about my situation." "I know," I said. "I heard some of them." "What did you hear?" "That no decent man would want a widow with debt," I said. She pulled a stitch through the leather. "And what did you think of that?" "I thought they were counting wrong," I said. She looked up at me then, and for a moment said nothing. Then she looked back at her work and pulled the next stitch. "They were counting wrong," she said. "We were married in the spring, on the last Saturday of April, when the pastures had come back and the east parcel, which I had by then come to think of simply as the east parcel, without the weight it had carried the previous fall, was showing the first good grass of the year. Eleanor stood with her mother and held Lily through the ceremony with a composure that was genuine rather than performed, which is a distinction worth noting. Grace had somehow acquired a wildflower that was not technically in season yet and had it tucked behind her ear with the confidence of a child who has decided that certain rules are suggestions. Afterward at supper, Grace asked me directly, in the way she asked everything, sideways first and then straight, whether I planned to change anything about the farm. "What things were you thinking of?" I asked. She considered. "The fence on the south side is still the way Papa put it," she said, "and the water trough in the near pasture has a crack in the stone." "I know about the trough," I said. "I was planning to look at it Monday." "And the south fence?" "The south fence is fine," I said. "Your father put it in right. I wouldn't change a thing about it." She looked at me for a moment with those sideways and then straight eyes of hers, and whatever she was measuring came out in my favor, because she nodded in the way of someone filing a decision away for permanent reference and went back to her supper. I have thought about that meal often in the years since, about Grace's question and what it was really asking, which was not about the fence or the trough, and about my answer, which I gave without thinking because it was simply true. I wasn't there to change what Conrad had built. I was there to help keep it. The east parcel is still in the family. The trough was repaired that Monday with cut stone and good mortar, and it has not cracked again. The south fence stands exactly as Conrad put it, and I have mended it twice in the years since but never moved a post, because there was no reason to, and because some things are worth keeping in the position a good man left them. Eleanor is 18 now, and teaches the younger children in the county when the schoolhouse is open, which it is more reliably than it used to be, in part because she pushed for it. Grace is 13 and has her father's way with cattle and her mother's way with numbers, which is a combination that will serve her extremely well. Agnes manages the books for the whole operation, which is larger than it was because we merged the grazing rights on the creek bottom and the combined herd has done well. There are still men in Gretna who count widows with debt as a losing proposition, they are still counting wrong. What they're missing isn't complicated, and it isn't a secret. It's that debt is a number, and numbers can be resolved. And what a person does with the years they're given in the face of loss and difficulty and a winter that doesn't ask permission before it arrives. That is not a number. That is a character. And a woman who has it will make something worth having out of whatever ground she's standing on, given a fair chance to do it. Agnes had the character. The debt was just arithmetic. I did the arithmetic. I showed up the following Tuesday. The rest of it has been the best years of my life.